Hello, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. In this episode, we talk to Adrienne Reynolds and Shivam Bhatt of the Commanderin Podcast about a number of different topics relating to religion in magic, as well as specifically whether or not Gerrard of the Weatherlight was a messiah figure in magic history. This is an episode that I personally have been really interested in for a long time. I'm very invested in the Weatherlight Saga. It was one of the first points that I entered into magic lore. And so I really hope that you enjoy this discussion, which I think took a lot of different turns and a very different direction than I expected when I first wrote it. I apologize that the audio is a little bit clippy in some points due to my audio file being corrupted of my dialogue. I had to do some editing fixes that sort of synced up those areas and kept them from being larger, long pauses. So if you'll forgive me for a couple of those little clicks and pops, I tried to get most of them, then I think you'll have a great adventure through this episode. So without any further ado, let's get to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Goblin Lore Podcast. Another episode. We have some very special guests today. I'm going to start you off by letting you know that my name is HobbsQ. I can be found on Twitter at HobbsQ. And I would like to introduce you to both our guest and to my co-host.
Hi, my name is Shivam Bhatt. You might know me as Electrotal or Gears on the Twitters. I'm the co-host of the Commanderin Podcast, and I have things to say about magic.
I am glad we decided to have you on then.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Adrienne Reynolds. I'm a long-time magic player. I've been here since the beginning, and I am the ethnographer that is still in the middle of a longitudinal study that is ethnographic of the cultural actors in Magic the Gathering. So most people know me as Dreamtime Drim on Twitter. I had stopped making content while I was doing the study, but I'll probably start doing that again.
I'm Alex Niman, one of the normal hosts of the cast, and found on Twitter at Alexander Newm.
So today we're going to be talking with our guests about kind of the purpose of religion and Messiah stories, and also their relationship with Magic the Gathering. As we normally do with our Burning Inquiry, kind of add an intro question to get to know everybody. We want to kind of ask people, if you could start your own MTG religion, what would be one central tenet of it? I'm going to start off now because I already need one of our co-hosts' help to make sure I am not butchering my tenet. So, Adrienne, mine would be in the concept of mitzvah, but it would probably be more the lay version of doing good deeds versus just a commandment, because I know a mitzvah at its core is just one of the commandments.
Well, all right. So the word mitzvah is actually not a singular meaning. The word mitzvot is obligation more than any of the other things. And it is an obligation because of a contractual relationship. So people may have heard Shivam's take on how WotC treats God specifically. But one of the things that WotC has a tendency to do in its published media is undermine white's concept of rules and order into something that inevitably into fascism. So the idea of reciprocal rules or reciprocal statuses of obligation to each other is not reflected in most conceptualizations of white, or it's only reflected when it's in combination with green. So the thing about a mitzvah is, let's take a pleasant mitzvah. There is a mitzvot, a commandment that anything that you use to celebrate a ritual in Judaism, you should make it a thing of beauty. And the thing of beauty just means to be within your means or within your own personal aesthetic. But if you're using it, like there's a hand washing ceremony where you need a special cup because the way you have to say the prayer, it's got special handles to make it easier to say that prayer and hit the physical ritual. So it's a laver cup. So if you have a laver, you should make that the most beautiful laver to you that you can. within either your capacity or your means, so that when you're using it, it adds an extra moment of beauty to something that's really a rote blessing. The commandment, the mitzvah, the obligation, the blessing, those are all together, but it's the obligation. The contract we have with divine says, do this blessing. The terms of the contract are make it beautiful when you do it. The effect of a mitzvah is some days you may not be feeling very close to God, but at least you have a thing of beauty in your hand, and you and God worked on that thing of beauty together. That's the real thing. The concept of an obligation in America, especially in individualization, is received as a compulsion as opposed to a willing reciprocal agreement. Because there's also all sorts of mythology in Judaism about God owing us things and not always understanding humans, and so doing it wrong. So there's a lot of words that do not get communicated unless you're inside the religion. So if you want mitzvah to be one of your tenets, maybe the best way to think of it is for every commandment, for every deed that has to be done, there has to be something that benefits both, well, all three really. The human, the human is speciesist in magic. Hold on.
Well, I mean, this is, I guess.
The entity
yes.
worshiping, the entity engaged in reciprocal worship, and the community around both.
Thank you.
If
so
it
that
doesn't
was mine.
do that, it's wrong.
Wrong, and definitely yes.
So I was looking at the question and trying to figure out what I would do, and so I just started from the actual game of Magic, and I said, well, what do I like to do? And I like to play lands, like as many lands as I can play in a turn. I keep a die that my land drop counter. So I was going to say something. I was going to say something flippant about, well, just play as many lands as you can. And then I realized, thinking about that in fiction, at least in early Magic fiction, I don't think Wizards has used this picture of Magic lately, but in the beginning, drawing mana was taking the energy from the land that you're familiar with, the places you've been. And so in fiction, playing a lot of lands would be like traveling and going to see other places. And so I'm like, that actually would be a nice central tenet, at least the endeavor to journey to different places and to see different lands, because don't want to make a requirement of it. There's a lot of circumstances which people can't really travel, but it is a thing that you should aim to do.
If I could start a religion in Magic, what would it be? Honestly, I think it would definitely be something like, what would a tenet be? I mean, I don't know. It's like in the concept of the game, it would definitely be something like, because I like to play go wide strategies, right? And I like to also play like lands and stuff. I think it would be something very much like what Selesnya's got going on, or what like a mono white type of if you're all in play together, you get bonuses from communing, from being together. You're stronger together is kind of what like the tenet, the kind of core ethos I would be going for in a magic religion is like, we're here to help each other, heal each other, and prevent damage from your neighbors type of thing. I think that's the kind of religion that I would build. It would be a nurturing, protecting, and give all of your tokens indestructible religion.
Yeah, I was wondering if you would. I mean, would you end up with Convoke as one of your?
I think Convoke is a great mechanic for evoking that kind of communal working together to get something done, right? Or Convoke is good. Battalion, even though it's got the martial name, the imagery of all of us going together and having benefits come from it, it's just really powerful to me. Like, for me, religion is not like, it's weird because everybody's got this image of Eastern religion as being like, oh, look, the solitary monks their faith emerges from within. They sit and they meditate on mountains and whatever. Yeah, that's all true, but that's the end game. That's what you do once you've like escaped society, become enlightened or whatever, or renounced everything and moved off to the hills and the mountains yourself. The rest of us who are in this teeming massive humanity with the 20 gillion people who are out there have to work together communally to get things done. Right? Like, all of our ceremonies and services and stuff are all about bring everybody in the family together, and then everybody who's not in the family together, who is also basically in the family because, we kind of live next to each other and that's good enough for us. And let's all do something together and make this great and powerful kind of evocation of communal worship and togetherness.
Kind of brings us a little bit into the topic of what we were going to discuss today. because our story that we're using for our basis for the actual lore portion of the show comes from Dominaria, and it comes specifically from the character of Gerrard.
It's interesting because Jesus going through trials and ordeals and learning, he didn't learn about who he was. He always knew theoretically, according to New Testament text, who he was, but wasn't supposed to make a big deal out of it. Like if you take the text at its word, the aspect of God that did not understand how to talk to humans had to take a human form and became God's only son, God's self. So I can see the connection between Urza and Bloodlines and Gerrard that way. I don't have the thing I need, I'm going to make it. So that part is resonant to me, but Gerrard as Christ figure does not work for me because of the way that they are extremely clear in the text that they are just actually putting him through Campbell's hero's journey, which is not the same as a messianic journey. However, Miri is much more clearly a Christ-like figure in the Sun King Christ. But mostly, don't you think Karn is the Messiah in this story? And the story is still going. Because maybe you're not saving Dominaria, maybe you're saving the multiverse. I mean, Karn is specifically a golem, which means a very, very set of specifics to me. But
Yes.
But let's roll it back, because I have questions. Because one of the things that people maybe need to understand about a Jewish messianic tradition is we don't have one initially. When we tried to make a king, God didn't want us to have a king. God wanted religion to be religion and people to live with each other according to our contractual rules. So God was kind of like pro-socialism. And then people misbehaved so much that basically all of the cries go out from the community, God, you have to give us a king so we're respected like other nations. And remember, this is a concept where we believe that God has to appoint a king for the king to have right to rule. So he appoints Saul, and that doesn't go very well if you read the Bible. The king, he had a system of, the initial setup of Israel is a system of judges. The initial system of judges, the first one mentioned, is actually Deborah. So it is not a male patriarchal centered thing. And basically people kept whining until they got what the other countries had. So right now we're dealing with a situation where all of the things that a concept of a Messiah is based on a thing that the community and God did not agree on from jump. So that's problem one. Problem two is this. Even the most black hat orthodox people who will make me scream and rant on the internet against, my group of fanatics, none of us believe in a Messiah that's going to come save us. And we have a reason for that. We have a historical reason for that, because that's gone very badly for us in the past. Because you can scam an entire group of people once you believe that you have a Messiah who will save you. But even the Lubavitch are running around talking to other Jews because they have a belief that if every Jewish woman lights Shabbat candles at the same time, realize they don't have to believe, they just have to be doing the ritual, which is important because that doesn't make it less than, it actually makes it more important. If we are all engaged in a specific act of mitzvot, and it's all of the women who are doing it, then we get the Messiah, then we get the Messiah. Messianism is not an original part of Judaism. It got tacked on. We had Messiah and Bealer. That's a different. But once we got it, the conceptualization is when we have achieved a single moment of world peace, then the Messiah can enter. And because the Messiah can enter, then we will have somebody who will help us rule justly. But it's a completely earthly priest. It doesn't mean anything for later. It doesn't absolve us of our sins. God can't do that now. So a Messiah is not going to do it later. So you have to think about that in that terms. We have to earn our Messiah. We have to earn the ruler we so desperately wanted that is truly divine. We don't get it until we figure out how to have world peace. That's a fundamentally different concept of who's coming. So when you look at it from that lens, Gerrard can't be the Messiah. because nobody's earned it, okay? But Karn can be. And Karn can be because the roots of what will allow salvation are inactive in him, and he can be used for good or ill, but he can be shaped and molded and filled by his own experiences, the intent of being in the world in a way the divine or Urza can't. He can speak to the many things that are in conflict from points of knowing, which none of the players in this conflict can. So in that sense, Gerrard is like Joseph, and Karn is the Messiah, and Urza is God. So.
Oh wait, what?
Well,
that's awkward.
Well, I mean, but remember, we believe in this conceptualization. If you need a Messiah to come out of this, and it needs to be, and honestly, if it needs to be the white guy, because there's no really good reason for that, except this is the dude who's going to be really good with artifacts. So he is a hero, but is Jesus in Scripture really a hero? Because I don't think he is. I think the concept of the Messiah is something outside of a hero. So I think Gerrard is somebody who's struggling with being, but I think another part of being the Messiah is knowing. Here's the thing. If I were Christian and I were waiting for God to send me Jesus back, Jesus's main function was to speak to the people. And Mr. Rogers existed. And if Jesus is better than Mr. Rogers, that's really impressive. I will have to change my current status. But if I were Christian, I would be looking at it and going, I think y'all missed it. I think you weren't paying attention. And he was on
That's
TV
what I've been saying the
everything.
whole time.
Mr. Rogers exists, so therefore
Mr. Rogers exists, so therefore what are you waiting
came and went,
for?
guys. You missed the window.
we missed it.
I mean, he might try again. He really seems to believe the best in humans, and so like we might get in, another 1,000 years, another Mr. Rogers. But when I think of the Jesus of Christian, particularly Christian women that I've known and loved, who worship with a whole amazing heart, who don't soft sell the problems of the structure that they are in, who still reach out, they are lights of God. And I think of them and go, if Jesus exists, he should be so fucking proud that anybody like that is willing to do anything in his name, and he better deserve them.
If Mr. Rogers had been Indian, we would have had temples to him already. That's all I'm saying. like this whole Western idea, the iconoclasm of the West, which prevents us from celebrating people who are really good at making other people like each other, has been just really, really frustrating. In terms of for folks like Mr. Rogers and his predecessors, who were here to give you this kind of continuity of faith tradition, stemming back from Jesus, etc., etc. We forget these people through history, and then they have to start over from scratch every time because of this iconoclasm that we can only celebrate the progenitor or the last prophet, if in the case of Islam, and that just means that so much institutional knowledge of how to be good to other people gets lost, right? And so when we're talking about things, that's why I really I love the monomyth. I love that idea of the hero's journey, of the pathways you take. But that is a way to study different stories that have been told through history. That is not the tree that you build your story upon. And the problem with the Weatherlight story is decided that the monomyth, which was in vogue in the early 90s, was the best framework for a story there is. So let's just take our story, find people who fit these slots, plug them into the monomyth slots, and then just go to town. And what that means is you get a formulaic story that doesn't work. And it's a story that is so fixed on trying to hit all these points of okay, well, this guy's got to rise up. He's got to hit conflict. He's got to doubt himself. He's got to come back and resurrect and save the world and be the Messiah figure and then die. It's just that's how you're missing the point, right? You are building with the framework, but you're not filling in. You're not coloring inside the lines. You're drawing the outline of the story and then taking that to be the story. And that's why I always thought that the Weatherlight story just sucked, because of the fact that even now Dominaria has gone a long way to fixing that. But the idea, it's just it's so many holes in this plot and so many, and I don't mean holes in oh, this plot doesn't make sense. I mean, in the sense of it's a hollow story. It's the semblance of a story. It's the idea of, oh yeah, look, here's the thing. We can map Gerrard to Jesus. We can map, all these things, people to like their various archetypes. But that doesn't carry any inherent meaning. It doesn't carry any weight because there's nothing there, right? Like there's the bubble outline of who these people are trying to be, but there's no there.
One of the things that happens when you write fiction, Gerrard actually, and this is where I think Gerrard is cool. So you have to understand, just because I don't think that he's a messiah figure doesn't mean that he has no value for the things that people would want in a messiah figure. So Gerrard is fighting this destiny because everything about this destiny is about death. Everything about it is a form of selfishness. He is forced to be in basically a video game plot. Collect all the items, use your special ability, and save the world. And there's a reason that the monomyth is used over and over in game terms. So the challenge I would have for somebody who is everything's so loaded because the discourse is so corrupted by politics. So when I say this, understand it's with literally no hate in my heart. But how amazing would a actual video game based on Jesus's type of success? So if you have to have the sacrifice at the end, right? Jesus went through a whole bunch of adventures. Dante goes through a whole bunch of adventures. You don't have to have the gotta catch them all and then turn the switch kind of thing. That's a very modern concept of how to save people. And it's not what Jesus did. And the self-doubt and the monomyth part of Jesus's story does not come from, and here we're going to hit some hot buttons for me and Shivam, which is you don't have to lose anybody. Jesus didn't run around losing people until he died. Everybody lost Jesus, right? So the monomyth is also literally in opposition to Christian concepts of what made a Messiah. It was a holy person moving through space, trying to talk peace, living a bodied life, and as a bodied life, sometimes it was difficult to feel the peace. That's the interaction with John the Baptist. That's why he's going through the Essenes and the Sadduceans and the Pharisees, because he has to experience all of these splintering groups that disagree with each other to figure out what has value to him and what doesn't, and more importantly, how to reach them. If Jesus is unifier, none of those people are not his people. All of those people are splintering groups of his people. There's a huge problem with cults at the time that's attributed to Jesus and splinter groups. It's an occupied nation. There's infighting. All of this should sound very familiar. All right. So, and that I think is what they're trying. I think that's where you can see the story in it. But Gerrard fights against the role, which puts him in a very different space than a willing Messiah who's struggling. He's an unknowing son. So he's hitting a different mythic archetype.
Yeah, absolute agreement. Like the thing is, because that's one of the things is that I think there's two things happening here. One is that we are attributing a lot more depth than the authors had the ability to provide us. But also, I think actually Adrienne just cemented it in my head, which is that Gerrard isn't necessarily like the idea of a messiah and archetype. Like when you look at old King Arthur stories, which were very much or like the Fisher King type of stories, that archetype, that messiah archetype, the character who is the messiah figure is always walking with this weight. They've got this kind of sorrow around them of this knowledge that they're carrying this salvation or this idea of salvation or the ability to save it, and the people around them are not falling into place or not doing the thing that will allow this salvation figure to actually help them. And so there's this just weight of like every step you take is just sorrow of like everything I am doing to try to help you and you are not working with me here. And I don't get that from Gerrard, right? Like Gerrard's kind of like, but he feels more like a JRPG. And I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but in the sense of like the hero of a JRPG, the young farm boy who gets up and is like, I'm the hero? What do I do? Okay, I guess. And he doesn't have the pathos to be a messiah. You know, he doesn't have that weight of carrying this whole load with him.
And then they try to add it on.
Yeah, they
added on by like all of a sudden out of nowhere, Miri is crushing on him too. Like all women love him and have to die for him.
yeah, that's
To the
just
point
like
where you literally mention it in character as the narrator that Gerrard has to lose them all in order to be able to come what he must. No,
Like,
he's
no, that's
trying to
not
run
true at
away
all.
from Urza and Urza's legacy and more death. And you have to kill everybody until you force him into it. That is not the same thing.
No, that is not a messiah at all. That is like that is somebody trying to make a messiah, right? Like that's like, look, I need you to feel this sadness so that you can do this thing. So damn it, I'm going to kill all the people you love until you're sad. Like,
Okay,
what?
and I actually have a direct quote that I'm going to read from Wrath and Storm. So they just got through telling the story of Miri, and I can go on a completely different podcast all by itself about how they misuse the shamanistic journey in order to set up anybody caring about Gerrard. That's a different issue. But remember that Wrath and Storm is set up with somebody, mysterious librarian dude is talking to Ilcaster, and Ilcaster is learning about these people through history. So there's actually a really good framework and metaphor about how do we teach the history of our own people to the generation that's going to come after. And then, so at the beginning of Dawn on page 191, and there's only 193 pages of this story, beyond the high windows of the library, the soft light of dawn steadily grew. The rumbles of thunder now seemed no more than a distant backdrop across the morning. Amidst the piles of manuscript and tremulously leading books, Ilcaster sat silent, tears streaming down his breath came in short, sobbing gasps. Before him, the old man also sat in silence. His face, as he gazed at the young man, was filled with compassion, yet there was in it a kind of watchfulness, as if he were waiting for some thought, now barely stirring, to burst into full flower. The light brightened slowly, and Ilcaster's sobs grew softer. At last he sniffed, pushed the damp hair from his face, and looked at the librarian. Why? He asked, his voice cracking. Why did she have to die? Why didn't Gerrard save her? The silence again lay between the two until the old man laid a hand on Ilcaster's shoulder. Beneath the parchment-like skin, the boy could see the veins, blue as sapphire, and the slender bones, worn and brittle with age. Yet he also saw, for the first time, an inner strength that he had not recognized. I told you, the librarian said quietly, that a hero is not just an accumulation of deeds. He is also one who has sacrificed, who has given up something profoundly important for Gerrard. Miri's death was the last step on the first stage of his journey. And then I rage quit. And then I rage quit. Because I've been screaming at this the whole time. And I did it
through the book across the room.
But like, that's literally, just in case you weren't sad, let me make sure we show you that the young boy is sad when the old man is teaching him sadness. The old man is teaching him sadness and literally telling him, no, Miri has to die or Gerrard can't actually do anything.
Well, like you said, it's that idea that what we see as the messianic is there has to be suffering. There has to be, like you cannot get there just by journey unless you have that pain, and everybody understands exactly what you've given up.
And
But
that's
if
so
Jesus is-
moronic.
If
Oh,
Jesus
yeah.
is the Messiah, he didn't give up any of that. So this is literally modern Western man going back and looking at its own foundational story, finding it wanting, and deciding that we're going to kill a bunch of other people instead. So that
It's
the
just-
Messiah gets to survive at the end and just feel bad.
Magic does not do faith well. Magic does not
faith-
do religion well.
But I think we can actually go back to Miri. Miri actually goes through a religious experience to choose a future and a path and a mate. There is no intimation prior that Miri is doing the Google Eyes love Gerrard thing. She's been his best friend forever. And so we also have to take a foundational friendship, one of Gerrard's 3 pillars of friendship, and change it into something sexualized or sexual or unrequited. That's not the monomyth, okay?
That's the manomyth.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell is doing a very specific thing with the monomyth. One of the things that you have to understand is anthropology was heavily compromised by gentlemen adventurers with money initially, because that's who had the money to do it. I can personally tell you right now, as somebody trying to do this study independently, no longer inside an academic space. I don't know how to fund it, but I know that 4 years isn't enough because the community keeps changing. So if you have the time and the privilege to actually do any kind of studying, it's going to come from capriciousness and arbitrariness, because the communities very rarely study their own selves or fund their own self-study. So these people go out, and it's a time of exploration, and it's absolutely colonialism and imperialism, but the knowingness of it is not quite what it is now. There's an awareness of misuse, and there's counterculture against it, but it doesn't have the same weight to it that 100 years of doing it successfully also complete. So there's a group of people who are just beginning to get access to study, and they're trying to prove universalism in a very specific way, which is to prove that everybody that's being studied is a full-fledged human, just like the guys studying them. And I mean the guys studying, because until Boaz comes and basically fights everybody so that Zora Neale Hurston gets to develop native anthropology and ethnography, that's what we've got. And they're not doing it from no self-interest. They are usually people who are just on the cusp of being accepted in society, that come from previously marginalized spaces, which is a thing that's happening in academia now. New people come in, go, oh my gosh, this is really bad. But then 80 years later, they're all whitewashed. So all of their ethnicities are erased. They're claimed to be atheists. They're claimed to not have a history. They're lumped in with the same white guys who they were actually fighting against, because they bring in the root of the harm to try to disprove the harm. You have to state the harm over and over again in order to prove why the harm is being done. And that's the problem with the monomyth. Universalism is incredibly important in the early 20th century, because if you don't believe that humans are connected, then you allow a lot of terrible things that were happening afterwards. And it doesn't age well. So the monomyth is one of those where he takes things from all over the world and finds the commonality. And then he will revisit it later and he will complicate it, but that part never gets.
And I'm wondering, I would like to, because Shivam, you've mentioned a couple of times now, but just the magic staff in general has handled religion. The lack of diversity that we've seen, the ways that they have gotten it wrong. And you could speak a little bit more to that and what you think that magic really needs. I mean, we've talked about this throughout the episode, but.
Okay. So here's the thing. And let me preface this by saying a lot of the people who work on magic are personal friends of mine, right? Like, I know them, I've known them for years, and we are all friendly friends with each other. So with that, like, I don't want somebody to think that, I'm just going to be slandering people here. That's not my intent. But the thing is, and this is just part of gamer culture in America, in the West, is that a lot of these people are atheist, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's like, just part and parcel with gaming culture. But what happens is when you're writing fantasy is inherently not an atheistic tradition. Right? Like science fiction tends to be, because science fiction is about the human ingenuity with technology over the issues that we are faced with in the world. Fantasy is always about kind of the externalism of relying upon the divine, upon the mystical, upon these powers that we have that are given to us either by, external divinity or by external forces that allow us to have this inherent ability. And so part of that is that there's a certain level of religiosity that comes along with when you're writing fantasy that makes it good. Like, one of the best fantasy writers out there right now is Brandon Sanderson, who's a devout Mormon. Now, like, leaving aside any issues you may or may not have with that particular faith, being of a faith of a devout kind of standing that gives you this ability to worship, to pray, to have the the spiritual experience, the numinousness of being able to experience a divinity, lets you write a character or create characters from that perspective, so that when you're creating your character who's telling the story, kind of what that experience is like, and you're looking at it in a non-cynical way, right? So you're looking at like, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to, like, let me just take, for instance, one of my favorite stories until it wasn't, Gideon meeting Oketra, right? Gideon meeting Oketra for the first time, he hears this calling in his head. He feels this like thrumming through his body of this divine experience. He doesn't know what it is because the last time he had a god deal with him went terribly badly, right? Like him and Heliod didn't get along. And so Gideon is sitting here like, what is this feeling? What is this sense of wholeness, this sense of completeness that I've got going on? There's this genuine exploration and this joy that you see because the person who wrote that story was a person of religious background, somebody who had faith, who knew what it was like to experience and kind of channel the divine. A lot of the times, and like for instance, one of the current writers in magic, James Wyatt, was a former and is sometimes still a priest in a Methodist church, right? Like he sits and he does sermons and lectures and he's a minister. Absolutely wonderful guy. And he wrote for D&D for 20 years, which made a lot of really, really good and fascinating moments. But the thing is though, like a lot of the people who wrote the story are atheists and some of them are anti-theists, right? Like there's a difference between passive atheism, I don't believe in God, and active anti-theism. God is not only not real, but is actively harmful to society. And when you have that kind of anti-theistic idea, you can, when you're writing a theological story, your inherent, like, I guess the take that you're starting with, the position you're starting with, is not that religion is something of hope, of optimism, of unity, of a strength that you don't have that lets you get through the world. It is instead something that is controlling you, something that is misguiding you, something that is deluding you from the reality that you're stuck in, and then is leading you down a path that will lead to your destruction, right? Like, I'm not saying that this is not true of religion. I'm not saying that all religion is great. But when everybody writing the religion in Magic the Gathering is coming from that angle. So you guys remember the expansion, The Dark?
Mm-hmm.
So The Dark was created entirely by Jesper Mirfors. Jesper was the first art director of Magic the Gathering, and he created, for instance, the mana symbols and the original basics. And he is very much an anti-theist person, and he created The Dark entirely as a set standalone that has no relation to any story or nothing, but with the idea of being able to just make a set where he's like, everything is about like the evils of religion. That was like, he did an interview. He was like, I wanted to show off how terrible religion is. So I made this whole set about it. For instance, you see things like the Inquisition in there. You see like Preacher, which steals it's like the white card that steals your characters, your creatures permanently. Like it's got all of this horrific kind of just like imagery and sentiment about the fact that there's no value in religion. And from that starting point, Magic has never had, except for that one story where Gideon meets Oketra, has never had a scene of religion, of being of value, of hope, of bringing anything good to the characters who are religious. It's always been a crutch that has brought them down, or has been something that has been used to bludgeon them or to hobble them from being able to express themselves. Or they're shown that their deity is actually Soren Markov, the selfish vampire, who's just like, harvesting them for blood, or Nicol Bolas, who is just like, a self-absorbed demon, right? And
he
like,
just wants to read his books. I'm contractually obligated to say that.
Which makes him a very Jewish demon, by the way.
Thank you.
No, because that's what our demons do. Like every human being.
Satan's a lawyer. That's all I'm saying.
Well, we don't have a Satan, so we're a little stuck that way. But we do. Each of us, each human has at their left hand 100,000 demons, and at their right hand 10,000. So there's a whole lot of demonology in Judaism that got very, very quietly shushed about the 1800s when Enlightenment era came. And we've always had an Enlightenment era rationalist movement. So that's always been a conflict inside Judaism because we're very Azorius. Not that you could tell by anything that's ever written about Azorius, but fine, because that'll be my rant. But all of that aside, like we can't feel the demons if something is happening and the demons world is interfering with our world. Something has gone horribly wrong. But the demons have the same contract with the divine that we do. It's just the demon contract. They're not allowed to screw with it too much. And every now and then a human wants something from them. And they're like, you're interrupting our studies. We're trying to figure out these rules. If you don't go away, we're going to eat you. And then, whoever it is will continue to pester the demons, and then the demons will try to eat them. And then everybody is upset. But like, you're interrupting the demon's study. That's a sin. You shouldn't do that.
I would just like to state unequivocally that having Adrienne on the show has been the best idea we have ever had. This completely supports everything I have ever said about Nicol Bolas, that we wouldn't be having the problems we had right now if he had just been allowed to be left alone and read his books. There's a
Damn
reason
straight.
that his artwork changed so much, and it's because people wouldn't leave him alone.
Okay, but he was born actually trying to genocide humans.
That's retconning. That is retconning, and I am not here for it.
Oh,
But-
okay. Then at least we can be on the same page there.
But the thing is, though, the
I felt
point I was
justified.
trying to make is that you'll notice that the story immediately after Gideon's actual one divine revelation has Aketra slaughtered in front of him, because even that can't happen, because magic will not allow religion to have any positive imagery anywhere. It's just not allowed. Orzhov
Magic
is
makes
the best we
magic
have.
makes every religion a construct. So you've got angels, but angels don't get angels. The way that they are perceived could be very Judaic holy sparks, but they're really not. The way they've written
They're
angels
just
and
constructs.
demons,
They're fables.
they're
fake.
golems. They're
Yes,
golems
they're exactly
of
golems.
mana. And I am pissed about it.
Yeah, that is
And
100% true. There's no. I mean, and look, like, what do we have right now in War of the Spark promotional art? The 5 gods of four of the gods of Amonkhet as zombies. Because guess what? It wasn't enough that we killed them. We had to rub it in as well. It's just
Bolas
like,
is not winning points for this.
it's like, my whole thing is like, look, then we got to Kaladesh, and I was like, all right, maybe we'll do spirituality. Maybe we'll get some positivity. No, not only did we not get spirituality, we got literally, like, they were so afraid of even having the chance of possibly having anything that they just straight went to literal full-on technology, which is the exact opposite of any kind of spiritual everything. Like, all of the magic in Kaladesh comes from the machines, comes from us recycling dead, like, sentient beings into fuel and then turning them into our powers, right? Like, that's what
Silent
energy
mana
is.
is people.
It's like, that's what energy is. Energy is like literally just your sentient goddamn neighbor turn into your gas engine, right? Like,
Which is fine for Golgari. That's a religion for them.
right, but not.
But not everybody.
But
not
the
whole
point, though, is
universe.
that literally magic goes out of its way, in canon, out of canon, over and over and over, to try to emphasize that literally nothing is worth believing in.
Ever.
Because everything you believe in is fake. It is a simulacrum. It is the demiurge sent here to delude you. It is entirely the world of Maya that we live in, that everything is an illusion. The only thing is real is your pure secular logical being. And that's only until you fuck yourself, right? Like,
And one of the reasons I'm so mad about the Sauron storyline, because I'm sure if you're online at all, you've seen me whine about Nahiri and Sauron, is because Sauron could have been a Messiah figure, was set up to be a Messiah figure, had created an act of loving devotion, and they decided that they were actually going to use like a hentai tentacle animal in order to actually be the real god. There's this beautiful painting in Barter for Blood where it looks like he's just an incredibly violent George Washington. His group would not behave in a way that allowed for everyone to exist. He couldn't save his plane because their greed was extending things. That's your Old Testament Messiah with some smiting. It's not Gerrard. It's not suffering. It's not everybody has to die and you have to suffer. It's that act of, oh my gosh, I have to save people. If you're going to go violent, it looks like Sauron killing off his own bloodline in order to protect the plane and the innocence on it. It's not a perfect innocence. It's a food chain innocence, but I'm a hardcore monotheist. My God holds both the good and the evil. I don't have extra gods on the side.
I'm right here.
Sorry.
I was gonna say,
Well, I mean,
this-
so mine is, there's a Elohim is a plural non-gendered word. And when I pray, I use the word Elohim. I was taught that. I have a very folkloric, weird history with my own religion that is a different show. But the reality is that it holds more, like the divine holds more than just one single God entity. And so God can be many entities. And sometimes my God is a smitey God. And you could have had this amazing story of a suffering God, a suffering Messiah in Sauron, and you threw it away for like baby daddy texts. I don't understand.
Like, I exactly 100% agree with you in the sense that, like, it felt like it was being set up for this entirely perfect, like, kind of sorrow and redemption arc of Sauron being able to sit there and go, like, because remember, Sauron's a multicolored creature. He's black and white. And yeah, he's a vampire, but he also cares about his people. You know, he does. But how about that? How about the fact that the one kind of, like, really genuinely caring, godlike creature, is also a vampire who survives off of his creations. What is that telling you about religion?
I mean,
But even that was amazing because he was involuntarily put there. That's much more Christ-like. Sauron didn't ask to be a vampire. His grandfather forced him to be there. So even then, even like if you want the complexity, Sauron had all of it.
I agree.
And you threw it all away.
And this is why, I mean, that's why Anguished Unmaking had been such an amazing card for me.
Oh god, and even the name. Anguish.
The name, the art, and the flavor text of that. I mean, that is a Vorthos hit right there to me. Because
it is, but like, how much better would it have been if the reason weren't the actual god that you made, the indefinable entity that are tentacle monsters from kaiju?
Not to mention, Cthulhu is not exactly the source point material you're looking for, right? Like that guy was weirdly racist and psycho, and let's not.
Oh, but, and then you take two of the angels that little girls were all using to make their commander decks and learn how to play with, and then you made them tentacle monsters, because that doesn't have any bad associations.
Yeah, it's just so...
The closest that they have to anything like a god, no matter how much they complain about, oh, old planeswalkers were too much like gods, therefore they were unrelatable, like the entire history of Greek Western mythos doesn't exist. I don't even know how you come to that statement to be able to say it out loud, but okay. I'll accept that and move on. But they didn't know how to write for it because they don't understand power. So I haven't answered what my foundational tenet of a religion for magic would be. But I'm going to
Did
now.
You have a plot for this podcast? Because you sure don't now.
No, I'm pretty good at bringing it back. But here is mine, and I think that this is a good place to point it out. In my religion, the population knows that there are planeswalkers and blind eternities, and they are the ones who wander, and you wait for them to come back. But magic is real, and it's real in a myriad of ways, and it comes from the land. And so my religion, the tenet of my religion, is the intersections of power and the holiness of waiting.
That's our show. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter, or email any questions, comments, or concerns to goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to support your friendly neighborhood gobslugs, you can do so at patreon.com/goblinlorepod. This episode of Goblin Lore was hosted by Hobbs Q, who you can find on Twitter at HobbsQ. This episode was co-hosted by Alex Newman, who you can find on Twitter at AlexanderNewM. Writing, producing, engineering, editing for this episode is by Joe Redeman, who you can find on Twitter at Findhorn. That's Fynd Horn. Our music is by Wintergatten, who you can find at wintergatten.com. That's wintergatan.com. Logo by Stephen Raphael on Twitter at Stephen Raffle. Goblin Lore is presented by Hipsters of the Coast, which you can find at hipstersofthecoast.com. Thank you all for listening, and remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.